Good morning and good afternoon. Good morning and good afternoon. I want to just welcome everybody that's joining both here in Washington, but those that are joining in Europe as well. We want to welcome you on behalf of the German Marshall Fund in the United States and our co-host, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We want to welcome everyone to today's conversation on Belarus. And of course, this week is a particularly important week in what has been taking place over the last year. August 9th, it was 1 year since the fraudulent elections took place in Belarus that led to widespread protests and really birth of a democratic movement in Belarus, but also an increased crackdown by longstanding dictator Aliaksandr Lukashenka. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, also director of democracy initiatives at GMF, and director of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. And we're really pleased to have three excellent speakers today joining us, panelists joining us that have been sort of at the front and center on the front lines of the challenges in Belarus. As many of you know, we've seen over the past year, August 9th, which was early this week, was the 1 year anniversary, but you've seen tens of thousands of Belarusians both arrested. You have several hundred political prisoners that remain in focus. And really, I think most disconcerting too is not only the ramped up purges, which we'll talk about in Belarus, but the closing space for civil society and independent media. And I would say, despite all of the deep challenges that have taken place in Belarus, one thing that I think is remarkable has been the bravery of the Belarusian people, civil society, independent media that have been critical over the last year and highlighting and bringing to not only to fellow Belarusians information, transparent and timely information, but also to the international community, to Washington and Brussels. And from my perspective, the work that's been done by media, civil society, think tanks, and others to bring this has changed really the trajectory, not only just for Belarusians and their future, but how the West views Belarus and its future. And I think we saw that over the last couple of weeks in Washington with the visit of Belarusian opposition leader to Washington, meeting with President Biden, the rollout of significant sanctions by the United States, UK, and Canada that, along with the EU, represent a real effort to bear pressure on Aliaksandr Lukashenka and to bring about and support Belarusians' efforts for peaceful political transition, new elections, and a release of political prisoners and free media and civil society. So we're going to get into this discussion today, talking to some of the leading experts, but also we're especially pleased to be able to do this with RFERL, and who has really borne the brunt and its reporters of this repression, increased repression, along with other journalists. And so we thought that we wanted to shed a spotlight today on sort of what's been taking place, what's the current state of the situation, what's needed to support independent media, civil society, and Belarus. And I guess I'm sure we'll go into a number of other topics as well. And so, we have very lucky to have a number of great speakers joining with us. Please note we'll have a Q&A session partially way through this conversation that will give you an opportunity to ask questions. But I just want to turn to our speakers and just do a brief welcome. Because I want to just jump into this conversation and give them the floor. I want to welcome Jamie Fly, who's the president of RFRL. Jamie's also Jamie, great to see you. Also a former GMF colleague. We really appreciate you being here because I know, just in speaking to you briefly, there's a number of challenges both in Belarus for RFRL, but also in spaces like Afghanistan. Aliaksandra Dynko is the reporter and contributing editor of Belarus Service, Radio Free RFRL. Aliaksandra, thank you so much for being here. I know the past year for you has been in different phases, and I think the bravery that you have shown and your colleagues in reporting over the past year. And one thing I do want to point out is RFRL has long been in Belarus working on these issues and bringing free, independent media, transparent information. And I think the reaction or repression, unfortunately, is a direct result of your results in bringing that type of information. And I see it, even over the past week, how important it has been to have you and others reporting on the ground. And Serge Kharytonau, I just wanted to welcome you. Serge is with iSANS, which stands for the International Strategic Action Network for Security. It was good to see you in Washington as well, as part of a large delegation coming to Washington to talk about a number of different things, including the impact of the current purges, which I know that you've been focused on and sort of bringing attention to. But also, I think one of the iSANS, yourselves, others, and your colleagues focused on addressing issues of criminality, corruption of the current leadership. And I just want to praise your efforts and that of your colleagues to engage, but also highlight and support the strengthening of engagement, Western engagement with Belarus, including the United States. And I'm hoping, and looking forward to talking to you about a number of issues, but also the state of civil society and how what's happening right now, and how do we keep that flame alive of not only engagement but support. And I think we'll be talking today about a number of things, both past, present, and the future. And so what I wanted to do first is to bring in Jamie Fly, and I want to Jamie, just praise your efforts. You've gone back into RFRL and sort of put a charge in the work that you guys are doing in a number of challenging spaces. Belarus has been one of the most challenging.
I'm afraid we've lost connection with Jonathan for a second, and if only I can take the role of moderator for a while. Maybe Jamie, you can tell us a little bit about what kind of challenges RFRL faced in Belarus within the last year, and how is it different from other countries in the region?
Sure, thanks, Serge. Yeah, good. I was worried that I was disconnected for a minute there. So I'll just get started. I'm sure Jonathan will rejoin. So thanks to Jonathan and GMF, my former colleagues, for hosting this conversation. So I'll just briefly give an overview, and people like Aliaksandra and Serge are better positioned to talk about the viewpoint from the ground, because a lot of my role at RFE is to support frontline journalists who are putting themselves at harm's way. But just to make sure everyone realizes who we are, we're a multimedia news organization. Despite the name, we're not just radio. We provide news and information to audiences in 23 countries, 27 languages, through a variety of platforms, video, digital. We basically try to meet our audiences on whatever platforms they're using to get news and information. And our mission is to operate in places where independent information is scarce, is under pressure from authorities, where a free press does not fully exist. Obviously, Belarus meets that definition, and we've been active in Belarus for almost the entire history of RFRL. Our Belarusian language service, Svoboda, was launched actually in 1954. So we've been serving that audience for many decades. I should also note, and I'll briefly talk about it, that we also have a Russian language network called Current Time, which also reaches an audience in Belarus and has had correspondence in country in the past covering developments, not just for those who want to interact with the content in Russian in Belarus, but also covering what happens in Belarus for a Russian-speaking audience outside of Belarus, which I think is an important part of the story of the last year that we should acknowledge. Our service has done a lot more over the decades beyond just providing information about what is going on a day-to-day basis. The service, given its work in Belarusian, has actually played an important cultural and historical role, helping to educate generations of Belarusians about their heritage, about their history, about their national identity, which the Lukashenko regime, even before the last year, as well as which the Soviet Union and more recently the Russian Federation, have really tried to extinguish or to smother at least, and to play down. And so our service has played that important cultural role inside Belarus. Even before the last year, there were significant challenges that our service faced. Belarus has been a difficult operating environment for journalists for quite some time. We had limited journalistic accreditations in country, even though we had an office in Minsk. Our people were routinely harassed when they were especially out covering political protests or dealing with controversial topics. We didn't have formal registration for our office in country, which always put it at risk. And we've seen the space inside Belarus close rapidly over the last year after the fraudulent presidential election. Watching what's happened over the last year, it really is concerning, not just because of the implications inside Belarus, but I think some of the tactics used by the Lukashenko regime, unfortunately, may become a model for other regimes that are trying to quash dissent, to silence independent media, to prevent investigations into their activities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that criminalization of journalism that we've seen. And I think we should note that there's a broader authoritarian trend underway around the globe right now, targeting journalists, targeting the media, and a lot of the tools that we've seen the Lukashenko regime use, we're starting to see other regimes use as well. And so we should be concerned about that as well. How have we been active in the last year, year and a half? Prior to the elections, we were already very active in the digital space. That, I believe, brought significant attention to us from the regime. One of our social media consultants, Ihar Losik, was actually detained in June 2020 prior to the actual election. He was accused of essentially fomenting unrest in the run-up to the elections because of his activism online. He's now been separated from his wife and young daughter for more than a year. He's being tried behind closed doors. After the elections, the crackdown got much worse. Our journalists faced routine detentions when they went out to cover protests. We saw many other journalists from other news organizations also detained for the mere act of filming or live streaming protests that were taking place on the street. We've seen several journalists sentenced in one case, Belsat case with Katerina Andreeva and Daria Kusova. They were actually arrested in a private apartment, live streaming a protest. They're now serving prison terms of several years. Thankfully, for most of the Svoboda journalists who were out covering protests, they would be detained, sometimes thrown in prison for a couple days, sometimes up to 10 days, then eventually released. We had that staff spending more than 120 days behind bars, in addition then to the fact that Ihar Losik's been in prison for more than a year. Our websites were blocked several months after the election in October 2020. And we also, it should be worth noting, saw Russian intervention in the Belarusian media space. You had a dynamic early on when the protests really picked up of anchors and other employees of Belarusian state TV who sometimes walked off, refused to go on air. There were literally moments when you had Russian state TV propagandists flown into Belarus to take over, to give advice to those Lukashenko media outlets. And it just shows how Moscow felt it was important to help control the media narrative inside Belarus. We played a role around that time through current time, also covering what was going on inside Belarus for a Russian audience. A number of our current time journalists that went to the country to cover the political developments were actually then kicked out, we believe at Moscow's request. And we've seen a subsequent crackdown against our journalists generally inside Russia, which really picked up after the events that started a year ago inside Belarus. And so I do think there's some connection between how those two regimes view the importance of control of the information space and the tightening of those controls. Even in recent months, we've seen the crackdown on journalists continue. It's almost become, and I'm sure Aliaksandr will talk more about this, impossible to do real journalism out on the street in Belarus. One of our correspondents from Current Time, even before he left the country, was called in and fined just for doing TV hits from outside his apartment. He had basically strayed 10 feet from his front door, and that alone was enough to be fined for doing supposedly illegal journalism inside Belarus. Many journalists have had to flee the country. Many news organizations have had their Minsk bureaus raided. We were subjected to that in July, just last month, when our door on our Minsk bureau was blown open. The authorities came in, it should be noted, with Russia Today's camera crew in tow, and ransacked our office. 3 of our colleagues were detained that same night before they were released 10 days later with potential pending charges that are still hanging over them. And now, like I said, many of those journalists have had to operate from outside Belarus to continue their reporting for the Belarusian people. So what are the needs that RFRL journalists and others have? Resources are key. That's not just a challenge inside Belarus. It's a challenge in Russia and many other countries across Eurasia right now. As I noted at the top, journalism is under assault from authoritarians almost everywhere you look. Independent journalists need more support. Second, journalists need more emergency assistance for relocations. Those who are under pressure, facing legal harassment, who are still inside the country, they need funding for lawyers. We need to make greater efforts to provide safe havens for journalists who have had to leave the country, which is an increasing concern, given some of the attempts by the Belarusian security services to reach well beyond their borders, as we saw with the case of Roman Protasevich, who's also a former RFRL Václav Havel fellow, whose flight was forced down over Belarus on its way to Lithuania. So all of these are things that Western governments can do to support the independent media, to support the ongoing work of journalists who are trying to provide objective news and information to the Belarusian people. We at RFRL are committed to continuing our almost 70 years legacy of serving the people of Belarus, despite all of these efforts by the regime, the attacks on our bureau, the pressure on our journalists. And we're continuing to do that because we know at some point the regime will no longer be able to continue to deny the Belarusian people their rights to freely exchange information and express themselves. And until that day, we're going to be continuing to work side by side with the Belarusian people, providing them the news and information they need to learn the truth about what is happening in their country, and ultimately empower them to make their own decisions about their country's future. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jonathan if you're back with us.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry about that before. Serge, thank you for jumping in and sort of picking up where I was leading to. So Jamie, thank you for that. And I appreciate some of the things that you said too about not only Belarus as a symptom of a global challenge as well, and sort of the interconnection with Moscow, with the Kremlin, with Serge too. I know you know a lot about and have been, iSANS is focused significantly on sort of that interrelationship. I'm sure we'll get into that conversation. And I'm hopeful, Jamie, that with the rollout of the Summit for Democracy, that independent media, support for independent media is going to be one of the high and top priorities for the U.S. and partners globally to ensure that this issue is being addressed, given the assault and challenges. So I think there's a lot of people pushing in that direction. And then I would say on Russia, on the Russia component too, and Serge knows too, is the rollout of sanctions, whether or not in the future, how Russia should be, and the role of Russia should be addressed. And I know that's something that U.S. government and others are thinking through carefully, and it's something that I'm sure is on the topic of Washington, Brussels, Berlin and London and Ottawa and elsewhere. With that said, I want to turn to Aliaksandra next to talk, just picking up on what Jamie pointed out, the deep challenges on the ground, and maybe just ask you about how the current situation looks for journalists, for media on the ground, the current threat level, and also maybe just a little bit too of your insight as somebody who's had to deal directly and sort of personally with these challenges as well. So if we could just turn to you and just maybe speak to the latest, and if you want to pick up on anything that Jamie said, including sort of the needs. And I think it's incredibly important that the US and others are rolling out sanctions that we hear, including Canada, the UK, the EU, but the support, this additional support that I was struck in a recent meeting. Somebody said that it's Belarus supporting Belarusians, those civil society, citizens, civic activists, independent media is as critical, more critical than the pressure campaign externally. I agree with that, but I wanted to hear from you as somebody who's sort of living this day to day, what you see happening right now and what you can share with those participating today.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. Aliaksandra Dynko, and I'm a journalist for RFRL, and I covered the events in Belarus from the ground last August and after that, but for the last couple of months I've been staying abroad, unfortunately, as a lot of my colleagues. Well, in August, the internet was blocked everywhere in Belarus, and now, it's even very strange to remember what we managed to do last August, just 1 year ago, because today almost everything is impossible to repeat and to do now in Belarus. We managed to do last August. We managed to do live streaming from our studio in Minsk, which is, by the way, now is ruined by Lukashenko special forces. And we had journalists on the streets in Tikhanovskaya office, and they report to our live broadcasting by phone. And they found witnesses from the streets who told us about these horrible events, and they gave them phones, and they told about the police violence and people's protest. And I remember this just days after the day of election, our colleague Vital Sigankov, he came to our studio just after he was released from the jail, and he was brutally beaten. He has visible beating marks on his face, and he told online about the tortures he survived and he witnessed. But at those times, we didn't know that situation would get worse. And where we are now, I think that Lukashenko understands that he has lost control over the existing reality, and he partly blames independent journalists and bloggers in that. And now he's trying to create an alternative reality where he's still a president, where there is no Tikhanovskaya, there is no protest, and everyone is obedient, and he controls everything and so on. And to achieve this, Lukashenko regime has done everything to outlaw independent journalists. Just some months ago, we were trying to analyze new laws on information and broadcasting, but now it's obvious that it's useless. I mean that there is no law in Belarus, and I think that it's much more effective to stay within the framework of your own moral code, on professional code, than to adapt to the so-called national laws in Belarus. Because for Lukashenko, every journalist who does not work for his propaganda is an enemy and criminal. And now 3 of our colleagues are under criminal charges. And they were arrested for 10 days, went under hunger strikes. One of them is in hospital with a difficult form of COVID. And our office has been ruined, as Jamie previously said. And propaganda, official propaganda presented all this event as some kind of victory. And you always heard about Ihor Losik, who is faced up to 12 years in jail just for being a popular blogger. Part of our colleagues are in jail, the others are abroad. They lost their country, they lost their homes, families, and if they are still journalists, they lost their names, because all reporting from Belarus is anonymous now. And this is a reality for us too. We have to report mostly from abroad. As a lot, we are not unique. We are not single in this situation. A lot of media, Belarusian media, was forced to move abroad. But we do not have like organized office still, and our journalists now staying in different countries even. So I think in these circumstances, the most important task for us is to build and keep the audience trust, because if you are not in Belarus, what could you know about the events which are going on there? So we cannot report from the ground and need to use a lot of UGC content. I think that there are two main obstacles here. The first one is safety, and the second one is fact-checking. And I put safety first because this is the background of trust to the media now. We need people, we need our audience to know that communication with us is safe for them, that we care about their anonymity, that we delete metadata from the materials, videos, and photos they send to us, that we not only declare, but we confirm that we are aware of different sophisticated methods that special forces use to uncover people, and we try to confront them. Fact-checking is more or less obvious, but I need to stress once more thing that there is no such a thing like an official comment today, because Lukashenko propaganda has nothing to do with the facts and truth, and it cannot be used as a relevant information anymore. We all saw what happened to the journalists from BBC and CNN who participated in so-called big talk with Lukashenko. Their presence was just used by propaganda. And the other thing I learned is that you need to be ready to anything and to adapt quickly. Despite other experts' opinion, I'm sure that Lukashenko is ready to block internet forever or to create Chinese type of internet control. And I could imagine that we will return to the radio waves and to the radio broadcasting as it was in Soviet times. And I can imagine people who are printing leaflets at homes and distributing them. And we are very close to this situation even now, because most of the media are recognized as extremists in Belarus, and people get arrested just for subscription to them. Well, maybe it's easier for the journalist because people don't want you to be optimistic or pessimistic. They just want you to provide them with the news and facts that you could trust. That's why we need to continue to tell people about the political prisoners and civil society under oppression, about the Belarusian diaspora abroad, which is now actually huge. And we need to cover Svetlana Tikhanovska's activity, and which is even more important, we need to become a platform for high-level expertise. Unfortunately, and happily, most of analytics and politics, economy, sociology, even culture are abroad now, and they are safe and they are available for profound comment. And this is something which Lukashenko propaganda lack at all. And we believe that people need analytical formats and even whole media created around them, for example, on YouTube and other services. And one more thing I want to mention, maybe it's only my personal opinion, but maybe not. Belarusians used to the situation when their problems are considered as less important than those in Russia. Belarus is used to be seen through the optics of Russian interests, as well as Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and other countries. And I think that this is a huge strategic mistake, and neglecting these issues, inaction, and what we call in Belarus expressing concern politics, led to the current situation when my colleagues who would have been saved were in jail. And there are no more threats to the Kremlin imperialism as democracies in our countries. And all the Western attention would have been focused on the issues inside the countries, I mean my country, Belarus, and not put in connection with Russia first. Well, that's all.
Thank you for, and I think that last point is so important, but also thank you for laying out some of the very detailed ways, some of the challenges and how they've been ramped up, and maybe also some of the things that might be coming down the road, like internet blockage, and which reminds me that this whole the engagement that you're talking about and sort of media and independent media is going through these different cycles and challenges and needs resources, considerable resources to continue to be able to adapt in these environments. And I think that the concerns about internet blockage, I know, are shared in Russia as well. And it seems like both Moscow and Minsk, I can see moving in that direction. But I think it's important to keep this engagement, and we appreciate you providing, I think, very detailed insights. One thing I wanted to remind those that have joined is to please, when you can, if you have a question, everybody's familiar with Zoom. Please feel free to pose your questions via Q&A in the Zoom function, and we'll do our best to respond to any of the questions that you may have. And I want to bring Serge too, who, good to see you again. Thank you for being here. Thank you for stepping in a moment as a second moderator. You've just heard sort of what Jamie's been talking about, but also Aliaksandra. And also I know that while you were in Washington, we talked a little bit about civil society, Belarusians in general, needs, things that need to be addressed. Maybe just you looking, past this, this 1 year anniversary, and hearing Aliaksandra, I'm just sort of struck by sort of the changes. You're right, Belarus so often was looked through the lens of Russia solely by many in Washington and externally too. But that's changed. I think you see this with the meeting of President Biden and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. That is a sea change in how the United States, the reception in Europe. It doesn't necessarily change immediately things on the ground, but it does change the dynamics how people view Belarusians. And I think, again, the images that we've seen have been so important, and the reporting up until today, so important to kind of reshape how people have been thinking, and that will need to continue. So Serge, can I bring you into maybe just building on Jamie and Aliaksandra and sort of your thoughts? And we've gone sort of back and forth beforehand, but I wanted to pull you in on some issues, including civil society, but how you've seen things change over the last year, and sort of looking ahead, some key priorities. So over to you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. It's my pleasure to be here today with the rest of our great speakers and my friend Aliaksandra. I must admit that I myself left Belarus on August 16th last year, a week after the protests sparked, and I was more on the research side and media research side since then, rather than a reporter, although I myself worked for the current time television in Belarus as the foreign correspondent for almost 2 years. Definitely the situation has changed dramatically, and as was rightly mentioned by Aliaksandra, we should rebuild the vision, and we should reshape the lenses through which Belarus is observed. And this is where the semantics and the language are extremely important. First and foremost, there has to be a clear understanding of what what kind of the regime has been established in Belarus. There are different variations. Some experts say that it's another version of authoritarian regime. The others might say that it's a totalitarian regime. Some would say it's military junta. Some would say it's a personalistic military regime, etc., etc. The most important thing is that the rules of the game have changed completely. There is no way back to the old good status quo, and I'm pretty sure that we will not be able to rebuild the status of free media in the same way as they were until August 2020, for as long as Aliaksandr Lukashenko maintains military control over Belarus. If we make some results of what has happened over the last year, the journalists have been detained or kidnapped around 500 times. I must admit that we should be clear that the types of actions conducted by the law enforcement did not really follow not just the international but also national standards for detention, and we may say that whenever a journalist is arrested, they are not arrested. What was conducted is rather an enforced disappearance of a journalist, but not an arrest by all legal means, be it the national standards or the standards that are being applied internationally. The journalists have been attacked at least 68 times. They were arrested under administrative charges close to 120 times. 29 people are currently in detention, and more than 50 journalists and media representatives are now facing criminal charges. So overall, the situation is a lot more dramatic than it was before August. There's been a completely different landscape of the media. And as Alexander rightly mentioned, Tudbai and Zerkala, Tudbai, which was the largest independent media and the largest online media in Belarus, was not just shut down, but also acknowledged as extremist media, which effectively means that now any person in Belarus who has ever in their life mentioned Tudbai or reposted news from their website or shared links to their website is now someone who may be targeted by administrative charges. So Lukashenko is building up a system which is very similar to how the Soviet system of crackdown on media was in times of the communism. We may expect that over next 12 to 24 months, I would say, the possession of literature that will be acknowledged as revolutionary, extremist, terrorist, whichever definition would be given, will not just be an administrative, but also a criminal offense. And most likely the stories of how people were arrested for keeping Solzhenitsyn's book and samizdat will become the new normality in Belarus. It's also important to understand that there has to be a very clear media strategy in relation to Alexander Lukashenko and his regime. I don't think the journalists should address or introduce him as a president. I don't think he has the mandate to be acknowledged this way. And the media should not just be objective, but they also need to be realistic about what's going on and what the status of this person is. It might be limited acknowledgement, it might be limited recognition for this person, but he is not the president proper, and this has to be clearly stated by the media in their reporting. Regarding the funding, I totally agree with you, Jonathan, that there has to be more support for the free media, and in order to be objective and provide the facts, the free media in Belarus are in competition with the state media or with the media holding that was puppeted by Lukashenko and once was state media, which has slightly $80 million annual budget. I'm not sure about the numbers for 2021, so I would refer to 2020. So $60 million out of this amount are being spent on Beltele Radio Company, which is the largest media business owned by the state, at least formally. And if we compare these numbers to the numbers allocated, the scale of funds allocated for the support of the civil society in Belarus by a country like the United States, it's twice as short as the number allocated to Beltele Radio Company only. So although we are very supportive and we are very thankful for the support provided by the United States, there has to be clear understanding that the funding that is provided to the propaganda of Alexander Lukashenko is twice as large as the funding allocated by the United States to the civil society as a whole, not just the free media. The Belarusian journalists are also competing with Russian propaganda, and to name the budgets of RT, which is the propaganda subdivision internationally, it's $360 million, which is a huge amount, and the Belarusian journalists need to compete with the sources that are being really well funded and that are being used in Belarus for the promotion of misinformation. In August 2020, there was a group of state propagandists from Russia Today who were sent from Moscow to Minsk to sustain the work of Beltele Radio Company. And this is exactly when the Belarusian propaganda, or Lukashenko's propaganda, became almost indivisible from the propaganda of Russian television. 9 out of 10 main narratives of the Lukashenko's propaganda became totally non-divisible from the propaganda of Russian television and RT for most. But the only important difference is that the Belarusian propagandists will not attack Lukashenko directly or indirectly, mainly because of the personalistic character of the system that he has built. So I would say that there are three main pillars that we should focus on. First and foremost, it's the security of journalists and applying new standards and new formats of work when the press or independent press has been made illegal and is essentially acknowledged by the active administration as extremist or terrorist groups. The second thing is the strategy. There has to be clear strategy in support of media and in competition against propaganda, in showing how propaganda is spreading fake news and misinformation. And thirdly, there has to be a clear strategy in funding, since the funds that are being allocated for propaganda by the Russians and by the regime of Aliaksandr Lukashenko are totally non-comparable to what's allocated for the press in Belarus. And I must agree with Alexandra that very likely there has to be a return to the old school formats of work, be it underground print media, be it television broadcasted from outside the borders of Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, most likely. And similarly, there has to be the reestablishment of the radio stations that will broadcast free information in line of possibility of the blockade of internet, which Lukashenko now can do at any moment at his own order.
Serge, thank you for that. Thank you for walking through some of the key priorities to support media and journalists. And thank you for pointing out, which I did at the beginning, about, sort of your past role with Current Time and sort of engagement. So I guess this is a bit of a reunion with folks. So good to know that. We have a couple of questions. And please, those that are joining, please feel free to, we have about 15 minutes, so we'll try to get through as many questions as we can get. And I think, I'm looking through here, one of the questions posed to Alexandra, I think, goes to sort of some of the heart of what Serge was just talking about too, is what in concrete terms should the international community do to support Belarusian journalists in the current situation, apart from putting political pressure on Lukashenko regime, declaring solidarity, et cetera. So what Alexandra, what might that look like? And I wanted to just bring in Jamie into this too, just on the macro level, because you're dealing with this issue in a number of different spaces. And I think you've had enough time sort of over the last couple of years to think a lot about, what the future looks like in these restrictive environments where it becomes more difficult. It's not, Serge mentioned, it's not the first time that you've had countries that have sought to shut down independent media. Examples of Iran moving this direction. Colleagues over at RFA, have been dealing with this, and it's clearly, it's clear. I think one of the most important topics when we talk about, if in this era of, at least from the Washington side of looking at democracy and supporting democracy globally, it is clear that this is one of the most important issues and challenges. Is the fight over freedom of expression, free and independent media. And I wanted to just bring you, maybe just to give a top level of some of the things that you're thinking that need to be put in place in order to address these challenges. So Alexandra, maybe I'll start with you to answer that question. Serge, feel free to jump in, because I think you started to answer some of these things, but you may want to add.
Well, as I previously said, a lot of Belarusian media, they were forced to move abroad, and they need a lot of financial and juridical help to organize their offices abroad. And I know that Tutbay, we as Belarus service and Navini and other Nasha Niva and other media, they need this help to continue their job from the other countries. The other thing is that we still need to compete with official propaganda in digital space. And I think that we all need some kind of a center who will provide independent journalists, not only Belarusians, with easily accessible technological decisions what to do, starting from the very simple questions like how to have an effective mirror website, or how to organize effective chatbot on Telegram, and so on. How to take UGC content which will be which is safe for the people who send it to us. And this center, I think to organize it, it will be a lot of help for everyone, and for Russian journalists too, and for other journalists in totalitarian country. And the third thing is that we still have people who report from Belarus, and they are under a risk of arrest and prosecution, and they need some kind of immediate help with relocation. As Jamie said, they need help with paying cost to their lawyers and so on. So this is a special fund to make this this urgent help available for them.
Jamie, do you want to jump in as well, just to build on that?
Sure. Yeah, and I really agree with everything that Serge and Aliaksandra have said. I often get accused of making too many things about funding, but I think this, and Serge made the case even better than I did, just laying out what independent media outlets who are providing information to the Belarusian audience are up against. And we see this across almost every country that RFRL operates in. State propaganda outlets are incredibly well funded by governments. They're well funded for a reason, because those governments understand that information is power, and that if they are not pushing out propaganda, are not blocking certain types of information, that their citizens are likely to rise up and reclaim power for themselves and have more autonomy over their decisions, which the authoritarian regimes want to avoid. So we see this in case after case, and the numbers speak for themselves, as Serge laid out. And when you add in then, as he noted, the RT budget on top of what Lukashenko himself is spending, it's almost insurmountable for small independent media outlets. And RFRL is well funded and very happy about our funding from the US Congress on a regular basis, but we're probably even one of the larger outlets, and those Lukashenko numbers still dwarf ours significantly. So it's a major challenge. And so funding, more concerted funding from multiple governments, for also the individual journalist needs that Aliaksandra was talking about, that is essential. The other piece I'd just highlight as well is on the technology front, which has come up, and also there were some questions about different means of communication, about a 24/7 bilingual audio stream. We're always trying to be adaptive. Aliaksandra and the rest of our team from Svoboda have had to adapt to this new environment. As she noted, we're not able to do things we were trying to do 15, 16 months ago that were possible back then. The audience has also changed, because when the internet is slowed down, they have to move off of certain platforms and start using new platforms. Aliaksandra mentioned mirror sites, which we're able to provide for our audience, in part through the support of the Open Technology Fund, which is also funded by the US Congress. So more efforts, I think, on those initiatives of finding new technological tools to both provide access to information, ensure safe and secure communications, and really ensuring that the content can continue to get into the hands of the audience on the ground. That is all essential. And to be honest, I think there's a lot of good programs that the EU funds or various member states fund, that the United States funds. What I haven't seen in more than 2 years now being involved in RFRL is joint effort. We talk a lot about transatlantic commitment on these issues. I think these are areas where it's good that everyone's funding their own initiatives, but there really could be some significant US, European cooperative projects in this area to look at what projects both sides are working on and come up with some maybe joint efforts to fund initiatives in the technological space, the journalist support space. And so that's one thing that I think is ripe for more progress in the transatlantic relationship.
Jamie, on that last point, I think there is going to be some opportunity, given some of the coming together at the, for in December for this summit for democracy, that I do think this is, should be part of the agenda. And I hope it's not only transatlantic, but global. And, we could speak another time about sort of how you interact with colleagues, for example, because there's different models of an approach from BBC to Deutsche Welle to others that are in these spaces, but also the impact of the work. And I know I've heard you recall sort of like even sort of during the height of the protests this year of the impact, and I've heard you talk about Russia as well, the impact of your work, and you're often targeted because there is an impact. Like it's sort of reaching the right audience. Serge, did you want to add anything on top of what they said? And then I'm going to ask you a question that's a little bit of a curveball that somebody opened up, and maybe I think I'm going to sort of maybe point to you. Maybe Aliaksandra might want to weigh in about sort of opposition and some of the challenges that you see that they're facing in after year one, because I think it's important, that there's so many stressors to this, you picking up your life and leaving, others too, families, opposition leaders who have husbands in prison, or family members or friends. I mean, there's nothing easy about this. So one, can you pick up on where Jamie left off? And I just wanted to bring in this dimension too, because I think everybody just, sees all the effort and sort of the outcomes of those efforts, both internationally and domestically, but this is all come at a cost and a toll to each one of you. So maybe you can pick up, because one of the questions was about, sort of different differences within opposition, which isn't unusual from my perspective. But one of the challenges previously, even in Belarusian opposition, one of the charges about Belarusian opposition in the past wasn't that people weren't committed to a certain perspective, but it was so fragmented that it had a hard time figuring out a way forward. Of course, when you have a dictator in place restricting, democracy and sort of the ability to do this, it's very difficult to move forward. But I wanted to, just talk to you, picking up on where Jamie left off and Aliaksandra, but maybe I could start with you and ask you a little bit about opposition, throw you a little curveball in this conversation, because I know you're following, what's happening externally and internally closely.
Yeah, sure. Just a few days ago, there has been a meeting of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya with other dissident groups, which in my memory was one of the largest meetings of that nature in 27 years. And there's definitely certain provocations against the office. There's definitely certain groups that are willing to be in charge of the peaceful transit process. And I think it's crucial for the Western governments and for the United States foremost to acknowledge that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is the only person who legally has the mandate for the peaceful transit, mainly because she was given such mandate by the population of Belarus, and verified exit polls conducted by Golos platform, a voice platform, prove that she got more than 50% of votes, even though the elections were rigged in favor of the other candidate. And I believe that without this mandate and without having the unity that we still observe, it will be impossible to reach any change and to achieve the unified front of action, of political action against Aliaksandr Lukashenka and his regime. So I would say there's certain groups located in Lithuania, there's certain groups located in Belarus that might be promoting the agenda of democratic changes, but are in fact working with their own agenda and seek their own leadership without actually having the mandate for that provided by what we might call the general population the people of Belarus, as populist it might sound. I must admit that there are definitely critical factors in sustaining the protest movement. And first and foremost, it's clear legal steps from Western governments, such as the recognition of Tikhanovskaya and her office. This is the provision of support and ensuring funds for the processes of transformation that will follow after the peaceful transit is over. One of them is the substantial EU funding that was provided at the scale of around $3 billion this summer. There's a discussion in the American government whether the US will support this transatlantic plan to make it truly transatlantic plan. I think it would be a great idea, and it will provide sustainability for the country after the process of the peaceful transformation of political system. And it would be one of the factors to call for the support of the existing bureaucracy that still remains in condition of, let's say, they are publicly supporting Lukashenko, but they are unhappy by what's happening in the country, and they are not willing to continue the existence of the regime as it is at the moment. So there are definitely, I wouldn't say there are cracks in unity. I would say there are certain groups that have their own agenda, that act in their own agenda to jeopardize the legal status of Tikhanovskaya and her office and the forces that joined her. But there is no major cracks, and there has to be, again, coming back to the issue of the semantics, we should not call Tikhanovskaya and her people the opposition just because they represent the majority. And effectively, Lukashenko is the opposition at the moment just because he does not have the majority of support within the country. And what he's doing is desperately trying to represent himself as an elected leader, as a person who has major support within the country, which is, again, done by the means of propaganda and the Russian support. But I would assume that with the newly introduced American sanctions, if only the instrument of secondary sanctions will be applied to Russian financial system, or if there is a threat of secondary sanctions to Russian major businesses or Russian financial institutions, I would say that the regime of Aliaksandr Lukashenko is facing serious problems, and journalism and free information are one of the tools to let people know that the bravade that Lukashenko and Putin show or express in public has nothing to do with the reality and the real condition of the Belarus economics and Lukashenko's support among the people.
I think that last point is really important too, on thinking through that type of economic engagement and support, including the EU plan. It's my hope that there's a way to prevent what many people are seeing being reported over the last couple of days of a potential IMF transfer of funding to the Lukashenko regime. And so I make it a special plug to urge, sort of the Biden administration and partners to look carefully at that, including the IMF leadership, to prevent that from happening. Aliaksandra, I'm going to do this too. I know we're at the top of where we're at our allotted time, and maybe if I could give each one of you an opportunity, maybe to add some final thoughts. This is such an important week in terms of just looking back and looking ahead. All of you experienced some deep challenges organizationally, personally, and I think even when we thought about this conversation today, it was a lot about keeping this focus on both in the West, but also thinking through how best support looks like, but also how to keep open information and media, civil society, and engagement moving forward. And I think there's a lot of good ideas today that to build on, that I hope those that are participating will also be picking up on in the coming weeks. But if I could, Aliaksandra, just give you 1 minute for a last word, then we'll go to Serge, and Jamie, I'll close with you.
So thank you. I just hope that the support from the world and solidarity that we have will continue, despite the fact that the situation in Belarus has not changed as quickly as we want. And now we see that it may be last for, I don't know, years, or as Serge said, like 24 months. So it's quite a huge amount of time, of terrible times we will live through. But I just hope that the support will continue, and we will not be alone in this fight for democracy, because now Belarus is just a hell inside the Europe, inside the center of Europe, and it is a threat for the neighboring country. So just be aware of that.
Thank you. Serge?
Well, one of the most important trends that we observe is that independent media are being closed. Lukashenko had monopoly on television, the monopoly on radio, a situation close to monopoly in print media. And finally, this year, they've shut down more than 100 websites that were related to political journalism and coverage. 10 media were completely destroyed and ceased to operate. So there has to be a very clear strategic vision of what the West expects from Belarus and what kind of achievements they expect from their own policy in this area. There has to be more support to media. There has to be more tailored strategy in relation to the sources of information and the ways information is being spread. So I would say we're really expecting a heavy time indeed with the trends in repressions that we observe. But there's also has to be a lot more engagement from the governments, specifically in relation to businesses. 75% of advertising on Belarus state television, which is a synonym to hate speech and which promotes disinformation, is being provided by Western brands. So there has to be a clear limitation on purchasing of advertising from STV, ONT, and Belarus One for Western businesses. And I think this is something that has to be done immediately, because Western businesses were not designed to support not just propaganda, but hate speech, which is very close to what we observed in the early 90s in Rwanda with the Radio 1000 Hits.
Thank you for that last point. We didn't get a chance to speak in depth about this, but we know it's a challenge, and looking forward to sort of picking up on those things, I'm sure, in the next several days and weeks. And also just on some of the points that you made about funding and just in general about, from my perspective, having a much, I know that Congress, which Jamie, you mentioned a number of times, which has been a strong supporter both of the Belarusian people. I think in lightning speed, 2 congressional caucuses were formed. I want to give a lot of credit to Belarusians, obviously, for inspiring that type of support, both in the U.S. Senate and Congress. But we're seeing appropriation bills go through with increased levels of funding of support for Belarus, and hopefully that can be part of the equation. But it's hard to plan long term when you're consistently having to fight short-term funding needs. So I hope there's a more concerted long-term effort to put in place and address those needs. And that goes for Jamie, for you and your colleagues at USAGM to have a much larger, much steadier stream of funding and support, that you don't have to consistently wonder if the bills will be covered, or especially when you need to adapt so quickly in a situation like you are in Afghanistan or Belarus or Russia, which puts incredible strains on a limited budget. And we do know that limited amount of money does go a long way, but you still have to have the resources to be able to be flexible. So I'm going to turn it to you, Jamie, just for the last point, and then we'll close.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jonathan. So I would just reiterate what we've been talking about the funding, about the need to support media. Like we've discussed, it's not just about Belarus, although that's the focus of our conversation. The challenges are mounting across many countries. Authoritarians are on the offensive. I think it's important, if we in the United States, if we in Europe care about freedom, democracy, empowering people in these societies, that we do more to support efforts to provide objective news and information to those audiences. The reason the authoritarians are focused on this space and are spending, as Serge noted, even in the case of Belarus, when you add up what Lukashenko is spending and RT is spending, hundreds of millions of dollars, is because they understand the power of freedom. They understand the power of people having facts presented to them and then making decisions on those facts, and they're afraid of it. And so I think we also need to invest in those means of reaching those audiences if we want to have an impact. We've had a very pessimistic conversation. I think there's a lot to be pessimistic about, but I'd also just note that I always reassure myself in my work at RFRL by thinking about all of the examples that show us that this is eventually only a matter of time, that the Belarusian people will eventually be able to have the right to be governed by people that they select. And a lot of the things we've described, the criminalization of journalism, the increased repression, these are acts of desperation by a regime that realizes that its days are numbered. And so I think we should also just keep that in mind. And my one final plea would be, in addition to some of the systemic support we've talked about, I would just urge everyone to please keep in mind, advocate for, highlight the cases of detained journalists. There are a lot of political prisoners who also deserve attention in Belarus, but in particular, journalists, people like Ihar Losik, people like Katerina and Daria, who I mentioned earlier. It's important that we continue pressure campaigns around each and every one of them. The regime needs to continue to hear their names, to be called out for their horrible treatment of these individuals, because obviously we need to get them released. And so I would just urge everyone, Americans, Europeans, to keep up the pressure on the regime about these individual journalists who are now behind bars, suffering for their work, to do nothing more than just provide information to their fellow citizens.
Jamie, thank you. And I think keeping up pressure and focus on journalists, imprisoned and others, really critical. I know that's a top priority, but I hear people talking in Washington and elsewhere, but it's got to be sustained. And I do appreciate the optimism as well. It's sometimes hard to see through when these things are happening, but I look at sort of somebody who's worked on these issues in U.S. engagement in Belarus, and I'm optimistic that that we have seen significant changes in how people are looking at Belarus and Belarusians too. That may not get Belarus to where it is today based on the current situation, but I think it means that people are thinking about what it looks like in the future, including Serge mentioning the I think it's 3.6 billion in euros that the EU has talked about, sort of a larger macro plan. And my hope too is that the US, other partners will be there when this transition does happen, peaceful transition. And I think Svetlana Tikhanovskaya talks about, one thing that I think really impressed everybody here is that she is talking about not about her reign in power. She's talking about ensuring elections as like that is the next step, and ensuring that Belarusians get the opportunity to decide their own future. And I think in that case, there's going to be strong support here in the United States and elsewhere for that transition. And I'm impressed by the delegation that came in through Washington last week. I think the same that you see in Berlin, or you're seeing in London, or you're seeing in Brussels, about the commitment to democracy and transparency, free and fair elections, free media, democracy. And I think this has laid a course, I think with the optimism, Jamie, that you highlighted about a better future and hopefully being the best possible partner to support Belarusians at this very difficult time to see that better future. So on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, RFRL, thank you, Jamie and Aliaksandra, for partnering with us. Serge, we can also sort of by your old connection also include you in that community, in that team. And thank you for your expertise and leadership, for jumping in as the substitute moderator for a brief moment. I just want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. We'll be putting up a video of the conversation that we had today via GMF and RFRL. And I just want to thank everybody again and have a good rest of your afternoon and good luck dealing with some of the deep challenges that all of you are facing. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Thank you.